Diandra Marizet Esparza is a community builder and the executive director of Intersectional Environmentalist. With a background in trend analytics, social enterprise, and brand storytelling, she supports a growing shift in how environmental justice efforts are created, organized, and supported by individual, community, and industry partners. So welcome, Diandra. I'm going to go ahead and invite you to share your screen, and I'm going to hide my video.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my little screen to guide us through. Thank you so much for having me today. It's really exciting getting to talk to groups that are just as passionate about access to education as we are. So excited to get into it. So again, I'm calling in from Team Intersectional Environmentalist. Some things that we're going to walk through today is a little bit of a crash course into IE. And first, we're going to kick off with just a little reminder for folks who aren't as familiar or are learning right now about environmental justice and just some origins of intersectionality, that language, why we're applying it to environmentalism today, kind of just to ground us in the shift that's happening right now. And we're going to walk through just 1 to 2 examples of what it means to really apply an intersectional lens to some of today's most common environmental issues that maybe we're all pretty familiar with or not, either way. And then I'll share a little bit about IE, our mission, our work, some of the ways that people can get involved and what that really looks like. And then at the end, would be happy to answer any questions that anybody has. So moving on over, just really quickly, for those who aren't familiar with IE, Intersectional Environmentalist, IE for short, is a Black-founded and women of color-led environmental justice education and awareness organization. We were founded in 2020, and we've become a leading resource for content and programming that really explore the intersections of environment, culture, and identity. And you can see many of us pictured here to the left at one of our Earth sessions, which I'll share a little bit about, one of our programmatic events in San Francisco back in 2022. So just recently, last year. So just to get into some grounding information. Some of you may already be familiar, but for those of you who need a refresher or aren't so familiar with the term environmental justice, or for the purposes of this presentation, EJ, we could refer to it in short. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement, that part gets left out a lot, of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. The picture that you see here to the left is a case called Bean versus Southwestern Waste Management Corp. And this was a group that came together to start advocacy around the toxins in waste management. And so one of the things that's really important that we'll get into as well is the legacy of advocacy for environmental justice. And I'm really, really glad that more people are finding out about environmental justice on deeper levels today. But the work definitely did not start with organizations like the one I work for. This work has been done for a really, really long time. So much beautiful groundwork has been laid. And the success of environmental justice is really marked by everyone being able to enjoy the same degree of protection from environmental and health hazards, or otherwise we could describe this as equal access to decision-making processes to have a healthy environment that really meets basic needs for everyone to be able to live, learn, and pursue life. So that's just a little bit of a refresher or grounding overview of environmental justice. Something else to note is where environmental justice really comes from. So like I mentioned, this work has been done for a really long time now, and there are 17 principles that were developed that define environmental justice. It's a lot to get into for this quick and brief presentation, but they are easily Googleable and definitely worth such a great exercise too if you're working with a group to unpack today's really important elements of environmentalism. So definitely do that with some friends or some pals, some coworkers. But the 17 principles of environmental justice were created after the National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991, where approximately 300 Black, Indigenous, Latin, Pacific Islander, Asian American, and other minority activists gathered in DC to discuss for the first time in US history the environmental injustices that their communities were experiencing. So that's what you're seeing pictured here to the left. And so then after really unpacking what environmental justice is, we get into intersectionality and what that is and why we're applying it to environmentalism. So just to give a little bit of grounding context on IE, or intersectional environmentalism, we'll work backwards just a little bit. I'll share the definition that our founder, Leah Thomas, created back in 2020, or I should say rather shared in 2020. And she defined IE, or intersectional environmentalism, as an inclusive version of environmentalism that advocates for both the protection of people and the planet. It identifies the ways in which injustices happening to marginalized communities and the earth are deeply connected, and it really brings injustices done to the most vulnerable communities in the earth to the forefront and does not minimize or silence social inequality. So it advocates for justice for both people and the planet. And after our founder, Leah Thomas, shared this definition, our organization was born shortly after. But before we get into any of that, it's really important to pay homage and to really know where intersectional theory, or the terminology intersectionality, really came from. And so IE, or intersectional environmentalism, is rooted in intersectional theory. And this was created by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And this theory highlights the ways that intersecting identities tied to identities like race, gender, class, ability, and many, many more can create connected conditions for discrimination or disadvantage. So almost like layers. And Crenshaw used her work to highlight the experiences of Black women as racist and sexist in a lot of different capacities and contexts. One of my favorite ways to learn a little bit more, especially if you're just now introducing yourself to intersectional theory or intersectionality with regards to Kimberly Crenshaw's work, is a TED Talk. So one of her famous TED Talks, she walks through a legal case study where she is defending a Black woman for workplace discrimination. And she walks through how she identified that a Black woman was experiencing layered forms of discrimination, and how being both Black and a woman impacted her ability to receive this job or be eligible for a job. And so that's obviously just one of many, many, many examples, but a really great walkthrough on Kimberly Crenshaw's part. So please feel free to go and Google that TED Talk, a really, really great primer. And something else that Kimberly Crenshaw has spoken about, and many, many people in our work talk about as well, is that intersectionality and the notion of overlapping identities leading to certain disadvantages or layers of discrimination did not start with Kimberly Crenshaw. Again, this groundwork for this terminology and the way that we're able to apply it today has been done by so many people. One group that I would like to just notably share is the Combahee River Collective. And so IE was coined today because this path was paved by people like the Combahee, or the folks behind the Combahee River Collective. And this was an organization of Black feminist lesbian socialists who experienced exclusion from mainstream feminist and civil rights movements due to their overlapping identities, which faced layered forms of discrimination. And so here to the left, you can see a march that they were a part of for the Black Panther Party in New Haven, Connecticut. So I encourage you to learn more about the Combahee River Collective and some of their really, really valid criticisms of the civil rights and feminist movements. So just to conclude this brief section here, want to ground us in the fact that environmental justice and intersectional environmentalism are two different ideas that work together as opposed to represent the same thing or work against one another. So I like to say that the easiest way to think about it is that environmental justice is the goal But intersectional environmentalism is the lens. So by applying an intersectional lens to environmental issues today, we can collectively empower new generations of environmentalists to heal and challenge awareness around the most pressing environmental issues in our communities, universities, industries, and more. So really briefly, I want to share just a little bit about what it could even look like to apply an intersectional lens. Two examples that I chose for today, even though there are so many examples, to environmental issues that a lot of people are familiar with, especially if you consider yourself an environmentalist. Green spaces, access to green space, and air pollution are two really common environmental issues that we as a society are grappling with today. So what does it mean to really consider intersectionality in those conversations? So one example, access to green spaces. One takeaway, if you are applying an intersectional lens to this issue, would be that access to tree cover and shade is drastically linked to wealth. And some fast facts that I think are really helpful for this context, even though there's so much research behind this. Some things that I think initially are really helpful is really understanding just how important trees are in general for everyone. So trees, it says here, prevent approximately 1,200 heat-related deaths and countless heat-related illnesses annually. And a 10 times increase in heat-related deaths are projected in the eastern US by 2050. So we already know that not having enough trees, shade, and cover in our environments is an issue. And when we use an IE lens or an intersectional environmentalist lens and apply it to this issue, it's also really important to really bring to the forefront of the conversation that Indigenous and Black communities face the highest mortality rates caused by extreme heat. We also know that the US is facing a projected loss of 8.3% of tree cover in urban tree cover by 2060. And that 31.4 million trees need to be planted every year to advance tree equity and slow climate change. So what we really like to do in contexts like these at IE is make sure that we're spotlighting community-driven solutions. So I have a brief little spotlight here in the upper right corner in white. Trees for Oakland plants trees throughout urban forests of Oakland to combat climate change and provide a more equitable distribution of trees. So there's lots of really cool organizations just like Trees for Oakland that are working to ensure that communities that are most directly impacted by tree inequity, if we would like to call it that, can have that issue addressed, and that people can engage and like personally take part in that solution, because that's what feels really empowering. So yeah, that's just a little bit about kind of a high level of what it might look like to apply an IE lens to access to green spaces or the issues around access to green spaces. One more example I'll share just for good measure is air pollution. I'm personally from Houston, Texas. As you can see pictured on the bottom right, Houston, Texas is not the most tree-friendly place. It was at one point, but not so much today. And if you research air pollution and you apply an IE lens to that issue, you might walk away concluding that exposure to air pollution is reallocated to Black and Latin communities. And conversely, Black and Latin communities are reallocated to exposure. So what does that mean and what does that look like? Well, to start, Black and Latin communities experience approximately 56 to 63% more air pollution than they cause. So that's what that data point, and if you research the data that's been collected around that, you can see that Black and Latin communities are not perpetuating issues around air pollution, but are being heavily exposed to it. So that's where we get that disparity. And going along with that, we see that white Americans experience 17% less air pollution exposure than is caused by their own consumption. Some other issues that are really important to take into consideration, particularly for Black and Latin communities, if we've identified them as most vulnerable, which data shows that we are, asthma and other respiratory illnesses are highly correlated to increased air pollution in vulnerable communities. And it's also important to note other industries that impact air pollution. So gentrification, or we could, maybe loosely say real estate development. Gentrification leads to the movement of Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities into neighborhoods experiencing the worst air quality as well. So down here below, some examples that we have are the South Bronx, Los Angeles, and Houston, where we see air pollution as a really big issue. Certainly not limited to those cities, though. And one highlight that I have here, in case you'd like to learn a little bit more about what it means to be an on-the-ground organization combating this issue, is South Bronx Unite. And they bring together community members to improve and protect their social, environmental, and economic futures. So please go check their work out. And so those are just a few examples of what it might mean and look like to apply an IE lens. And now that I've introduced a little bit about the origins of intersectionality, some of the really notable people who have influenced that work, although there are so many, so I encourage you to learn more. I want to share a little bit about IE and our mission. It was really, really interesting over the past 2 years trying to contextualize how to best position ourselves in this movement. There are so many incredible organizations. And one thing that I think is worth sharing is that when our founder, Leah Thomas, shared her definition of intersectional environmentalism, there was a really, really mixed response to what that definition means for the future of environmentalism. And I think the best way I like to put it, and that I've certainly seen Leah put it this way, and that our team likes to speak to, is that there have been so many people that have marched for conservation of animals and land and trees. But really, conversely, it's been found to be so controversial to march and advocate for the protection of Black and Brown lives, most notably Black lives in the past 2 years, particularly in the summer of 2020, when we were founded as an organization. And so knowing that so many of us that are part of this organization and part of just the wider movement, we certainly don't own the notion of intersectional environmentalism. It's for everyone. So many people who have really been waiting for a moment like that, where the dialogue could just the ceiling dialogue could just be cracked open, had basically faced years and years and years of people either dismissing the conversation or kind of wide-eyed, not really knowing how to hold that conversation or to carry it on. And so us knowing that there was such a large community of people that really didn't know what to do with that conversation or would dismiss that conversation, and then a really, really large group of people that have been on the ground creating a lot of these really beautiful grassroots efforts that are directly changing policy or access to education, or creating really beautiful community spaces to make sure that people have those third places in their community outside of home and school to just lead beautiful, joyful, thriving lives, kind of like a library. So we have these two groups of people, and when we were formulating our organization, we wanted to really make sure that IE could serve as a connector and a bridge. And so one of the things that, after 2 years of basically incubating so many different concepts and projects, we landed in this place where we decided, hey, we really want to exist as an awareness and education platform. And particularly being that the world was so virtual, we focused a lot of our work on social media and digital content. And over the past 2 years, or over the past year, as the world has slowly started safely opening back up, we've been able to engage in some IRL programming or in-person programming as well. So I'm so excited to share a little bit about that. But after a few years of really struggling to, not even struggling, but really just testing a lot of different ways that we could show up as an organization, I'm so proud and grateful for the space that we've been given to land where we are now. So just to formally share, yes, of course, we are still here to increase awareness and education about intersectional environmentalism. And we're definitely still here since day one, here to drive support towards grassroots environmental justice efforts. And what we have kind of nestled in as ways that we really appreciate being able to show up as an organization is creating educational media and programs that are accessible and reach diverse audiences. And something that's very important to us is that the educational media that we produce and the programs that we create are culturally competent. And so really bringing that to the front and center. And that's where a lot of representation comes into play, right? We want to make sure that diverse youth and that the next generation really can see themselves reflected in the environmental movement, whether that's in a corporate setting, an academic setting, in a community setting, whatever that may be, in a media, pop culture setting, whatever that may be. So we really bring that to the front and center of our work. And we also create networks of Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQ+, and disability-led environmental organizations in all of our collaborative projects so that we can continue to coalition build. So this is just a little bit about our mission and how we really appreciate being able to show up in this work. So just to give a little bit more behind the scenes sneak peeks as to some of our newer programs that rolled out just like late last year and will continue to roll out this year. So one program that we're really passionate about at IE is called Earth Sessions. And Earth Sessions are music and environmental education events that seek to build community and really celebrate the role of art in movements of change and provide joyful and diverse climate justice education to new audiences. These events, I think that when you look at the recap photos and the films from these events, they look like so much fun. And I think that it's really, really important to make sure that that becomes a cornerstone of environmental justice work, is that it looks joyful and empowering. And I think that something we're really happy about is being able to create a program that introduces people to environmental justice in a joyful and empowering context. So often when we learn about environmental justice for the first time as just people in the world, we're learning about environmental justice through the context of tragedy. And while that's certainly important to be able to hold and to be able to respond to as a collective, it's also really important to know what the joyful side of environmental justice means and what building an environmentally just future looks like. And we're able to emulate that in these events. And that's really, really special to us and to the people who have been able to support us and participate. And another element of the work that we're really excited about, this is a little bit of a newer program. I'm hoping anybody that's a fan of libraries and bookstores gets excited about this one. But we recently launched IE's Free Bookstore. And IE's Free Bookstore is a book giveaway program designed to increase visibility of incredible books written by people of color, that we believe are really central to radically imagining a more equitable and joyful future for people and planet. And we do really fun book drops, and we do them both in person and online. In person, which you see pictured here, that might look like having a little book tabling, book fair style moment at one of our events. I personally was at the event that's pictured here, and it was really incredible to see a bunch of 20 and 30-something-year-olds open their eyes really big, like they're at their elementary school book fair again. And so being able to spark that joy and really build like a core memory around the way that you received that book, and build community around the books that we're all reading and sharing with one another is so important. So the in-person delivery of the books is really fun. Additionally, though, we really love the idea, and we were really founded on the idea of curating resources around topic areas that people are really passionate about. In the early days of IE, and I also think I'm sharing this because it's also, I think, a great way for people to approach the work that they're doing. Something that we did when we first were founded was we launched a website that effectively was curated resources for people in a lot of different passion areas that needed support advocating for environmentalism with an IE lens in their respective fields. So we launched topic pages about fashion and food and technology and different identity groups as well. And so something that we're hoping to do, this kind of manifesting from that is to drop curated lists online of free books that people can go online and claim. So we'll be doing exciting little book drops throughout the year. But after the books have kind of come in and been swooped up, the book list can exist as a catalog or a curated reading list for people who are really interested in learning more about an IE lens in any given topic. I definitely believe that even since IE was founded, I guess I should say, one of the things that IE was founded on, in terms of my own influence, I'm so passionate about people really being able to be met where they're at and also be able to contribute in ways that they're really passionate about. So, for example, if you are not an electrical engineer or an environmental engineer or an ocean engineer, but you really, really love history, you should be empowered to be an environmentalist through the context of history instead of engineering or something like that. You should be able to, feel empowered to be an environmentalist through the areas that you're most passionate about. So that's why the topics and the curated reading lists by topic, I think, are really powerful and a great way for anybody to approach resource sharing. And so that's something that we're really excited about this year. And our reading lists are not going to be limited to just science books. They're going to span fiction and nonfiction, to amplify stories about how culture has shaped science, education, art, food, poetry, and so much more. I personally am really excited for a potential curated cookbook drop. I think that would be so fun. So yeah, that's just a little bit about IE's free bookstore. And just to end and make some time for questions and discussion, I wanted to end on IE's theory of change. So environmental justice education, as I'm sure many people know or are coming to learn, especially during a time when books are being banned from schools and libraries, environmental justice education is really absent and only becoming more absent if you're reading headlines from many environmental science and STEM curriculums in the US, from primary education to universities and beyond, which we believe is a large factor in why so many environmental justice efforts go underfunded or undersupported. And we want to make sure that they have the action and support that they need. And so we want to shift environmental education, movements, and policy to really center environmental justice and the importance of equity in these spaces to ensure a better and safer future for all people, especially those that are most impacted by the climate crisis. I'm personally from Texas, where a lot of education legislation comes from. And so I'm really passionate about making sure that people feel really informed about book bans, the history of book bans, and also that most librarians say that book bans are a big no-no. So yes, this is something that we're really excited to be able to address with the programming that we've had a lot of space to kind of nestle into that we're really, really passionate about. So that's just a little bit about IE. Thank you all so much for listening, for learning a little bit more. And I'm really excited to talk through any questions that anyone has or share anything else that's on our minds. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So just a reminder to everybody who's watching the webinar right now, you can put your questions for Diandra in the Q&A. But I have a couple of questions. I, of course, love IE's focus on books as a library lover of libraries. So, and I also want to echo what you said about, banning of books is absolutely antithetical to a library's mission. So thank you for recognizing that. I'm curious about the trees. When you were talking about the number of trees that needed to be planted, does it matter what kind of tree, or are there preferred trees or just trees?
Yeah, I think that what's really interesting about unpacking like what plants and agriculture are needed in general. So we could even take it like beyond trees. It's so important to make sure that we're connecting with organizations on the ground that are rooted in Indigenous wisdom and supporting, Indigenous groups who have been stewards of this land for so long, far longer than most people that that live in America today. And I think that that's where a lot of that specificity comes from, right? So understanding, well, what trees are invasive and what trees, will really thrive and actually produce the results that we need for the soil, for the air that needs to be purified by their presence. So yeah, I definitely think that it absolutely depends. We can't just plop a bunch of invasive species all over. I mean, we could if it's beneficial, but definitely working with groups on the ground, particularly indigenous groups, to make sure that we're giving back the land what it needs and not planting invasive species.
Yeah, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. Definitely makes a lot of sense. And so my second question is, you mentioned the joy versus tragedy, that much of what we know about intersectional environmentalism is rooted in tragedy, but that the focus needs to be about the joy. And I'm wondering what it will take. What do you think it would take for us to center the joy rather than the tragedy? And are they still both valuable? I mean, knowing that people are being harmed is, maybe motivating for people. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that dichotomy of joy versus tragedy.
Yeah, no, I think dichotomy is the right word. I think to answer your question backwards, I think that when we talk about, or when you learn about even other people's perspectives growing up, people who have a really, really good handle on the concept of joy and happiness and pleasure, these are usually people who also have a really, really good grasp on pain and harm and tragedy. And I think that it's important to remember that a lot of joy is born out of pain, and joy is the resulting script from what we learned from pain. And I think that it's really important to not engage in, say like a form of toxic positivity, where we kind of pretend that harm isn't real, or we pretend that disadvantage isn't real, or racism isn't real. It's very important to acknowledge some of the pains that have stemmed from, the things that we have created, or the things that were out of our control that happened, or the things that we perpetuate, so that we can understand what the world can look like on the other side, and that we are able to balance that with physically actually practicing what it looks like to live on the other side, right? And that's why we're really passionate about creating those educational experiences, right? How can we create 3 hours on a Sunday evening where people get to live on the other side of that, so that we can start to practice it at the same time while acknowledging it. So I think something else that's really beautiful for people to look into with regards to their own cultures is to remember and maybe even research a little bit that many of our more celebratory traditions across cultures are rooted in lessons around how to keep thriving communities thriving, which is often stems from some pretty tragic lessons. So always appreciating that they absolutely go together, and it's not worth creating, a narrative that's only joyful, because then we will forget some of the lessons that our ancestors have learned the hard way on our behalf.
Yeah, thank you. We do have a question. Can you recommend any organization in Canada to gain experience or volunteer that acknowledges IE?
That acknowledges IE or intersectional environmentalism? Oh gosh, off the top of my head, no. I'm afraid I live way down in Texas, but we do work with we have worked with in the past some great organizations that I could possibly pass along after, and maybe Liz could include them in a YouTube video description. There's honestly so much beautiful work happening everywhere. And if you are local to any prominent towns or any areas in Canada, I highly recommend you start checking out local organizations on the ground. It's usually pretty easy to find organizations with a quick Google, but I would say it's even more effective if you already know what areas you're really passionate about. So if you're really passionate about logging, if you're really passionate about fossil fuels, if you're really passionate about food or indigenous wisdom and culture or sciences. I think usually adding that into your search is really, really helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I think I have just one more question. I'm wondering, how will you, and I don't like to use the word measure, but how will you know, or what will it look like to have this movement be successful?
Oh gosh. Yeah. I mean, measure is a hard word, but I think that, going back to what we learn about environmental justice, I think that a lot of success can be earmarked by the evidence that people got to meaningfully participate in the development of our future. And I think that a lot of really positive outcomes will result from that. I think that right now the world is in a place where we are open to creating seats at various tables, but we're still learning a lot about what it means for that seat in and of itself to be an equitable access to that table. So for example, I'm trying to think of a context that might be really helpful. So many people, for example, are focusing on DEI training, and that's really, really valuable. But if you carve out a seat at the table and you just put a person of color there that isn't really qualified to teach that or share about that, and you're kind of just checking that box, well, you might have filled the seat, but that wasn't really meaningful access to that conversation for diverse communities because you didn't put the correct person in that seat. And there is no, of course, one correct person, but it's important to see the long-term effects of, okay, yes, we're creating seats at tables, but who is really filling those seats? And are the people filling those seats actually creating a lot of agency, well-informed agency for the communities that are participating? And for those of you who are a little bit new to this material, what I just walked through today is not DEI training. What I walked through today was just our journey in learning about intersectional theory from Kimberly Crenshaw and how we applied it to a wider social narrative around environmentalism. Our work is really hoping to, again, like I mentioned earlier, crack the ceiling open on that dialogue around environmentalism. And millions of people have adopted this terminology today, thanks to our organization and so many other people who have contributed to its application to environmentalism. So I would say that our work is very much, narrative. It's very much storytelling, which is how every system is built. So it's still very important, but it's not specifically a DEI training. So really making sure that we're being intentional about the people that we're bringing to certain tables and opportunities, and that it truly equals, like, this was proper representation for the outcome that we're looking for. And that is a lot of that's agency for community. And I think that's what earmarks, success, if we could put a measure on it.
Right. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. They're tricky. It's tricky, but I am so gratified to see, I mean, there are organizations in our community that are really leaning into this work on lots of different levels. And it's encouraging to have people at the table in conversation that haven't been included before. So I really applaud you in the work that your organization does, and focusing on the importance of it, because I think it's necessary and critical.
Thank you. Yeah, no, thank you so much. And it's really been lovely to engage in work that's allowed our own team to be able to collaborate and build coalition with people who have been doing our work, like elements of our work, forever. And I think that that's a really important distinction for the work that we do. We don't exist to create anything that's new. We exist to really celebrate the work that so many people, whether you're a local library or you're a local food bank or you're a professor or you're a writer or you're a filmmaker, everyone is telling stories and shaping community. And when it comes to IE, we really want to be an organization that celebrates that in a way that's constructive and moves the environmental movement forward.
Well, thank you. And I don't see any other questions, so we'll go ahead and end this webinar. Thank you so much, Diandra, for joining us today and sharing with us your information about your really important and interesting organization. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.